From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Coming up today, K-State's Dan O'Brien will talk about the positive takeaways from the monthly USDA grain supply and demand report released earlier this week. And he'll talk about solid soybean export business despite all the trade tariff concerns. Following Dan, then, K-State's Vincent Amanor-Boadu taking a closer look at the recent trade interventions, as he calls them, and the impact on U.S. agricultural trade that's already happening, he says, although the tariffs have yet to go into effect. He stresses that years of successfully building markets for U.S. commodities abroad are being put at risk. And as always on a Friday, we'll hear from K-State's Mary Knapp on Kansas agricultural weather, right here on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Thanks for listening. This is the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Well, the grain markets this past week were able to take a pause from all of the heat that has been generated over the trade tariff issues out there, as the USDA's latest grain supply and demand report was released, and with some friendly numbers to at least part of the trade. A look now at all of that with Dan O'Brien joining us via phone from his office in Colby, Northwest Kansas. Grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension. Well, Dan, let's begin on the feed grain side, and particularly on corn, where the South American production number was lowered by the USDA, confirming what we'd already known: they're having struggles, especially in Argentina.
Especially in Argentina, but not only in Argentina. There was also a fair drop in the number of corn metric tons to be produced, projected to be produced, in Brazil as well. And I think, as I understand it, the concerns are for the second crop plantings, again, late planted, some other developmental issues, etc. Turned out that the Argentine crop was dropped 3 million metric tons down to 33 million, for 2018, and that's down from 41 last year. The Brazilian crop dropped about 2.5 million metric tons from the March forecast down to 92 million. It was 98.5 last year. So I guess the way you kind of put this in perspective is the other major players in world export markets both absorbed cutbacks in their 2018 crop projections. And, of course, for a perspective on this, the total of Brazil and Argentina together is something like about 125 million metric tons. The U.S. crop in this last year was about 371, so still large size differential, but in export markets, there are major competitors. So that was a big thing. And with that, by the time we brought that over into the world ending stocks figure, the USDA dropped the world ending stocks down to about 198 million metric tons. And again, in perspective, that number last year was about 231. So here, Eric, as we've been watching these markets through the winter, wondering what in the world might happen to them and what could possibly give us some price support in the longer run, now we've absorbed some crop problems in South America. The issues that you and I were wondering about back in December, January, well, they've happened to some degree anyway. And with that, stocks have dropped about arguably 10-15%, and we're in a position on the world market to be a lot more responsive to any weather problems that could happen here in the summer of 2018 here in the U.S. now than we were as we were trying to gauge these markets back in January, February.
And then you couple that with the news that we've seen fairly brisk U.S. feed grain exports lately to add to the bullishness.
Yes, we, for the week ending April the 5th, had a reported shipment amount of about 76 million bushels, and that's That's up 20 or 30 million from what we've been seeing on a weekly basis. We need to export about 56 million to meet the USDA's projection now of 2.225 billion bushels for this marketing year. A good export week for corn is sure welcome. We also had a good export week for the week ending April the 5th for grain sorghum, just under 10 million bushels. We need about 4 to meet the USDA's pace. So in the midst of all these trade discussions and all that's been going on, here we put up pretty good numbers for corn and grain sorghum for exports, and that's a good thing in terms of the likelihood of seeing a little bit better prices for corn and grain sorghum down the line here in the U.S.
Now, as for soybeans, we've known for quite some time that the Argentine soybean crop would be short this year because of their extended drought. Well, that was definitely reaffirmed in the USDA report.
The Argentine number came in at 40 million bushels, and it could drop further yet. We don't quite know. Again, they've had what they term to be unrecoverable crop production losses this year from dry conditions in Argentina. It just is as it is. So if they come in with 40 million metric tons this year, they were at about 58 a year before. So down 7 million metric tons on a month-to-month forecast, and again puts them about 18 down for the year-by-year comparison. Conversely, the Brazilian number actually was raised a little bit, raised about 2 million metric tons up to about 115. That would be about 1 million or so metric tons greater than last year's record high. So still strong Brazilian soybean crop. The pace of use, and again, the shifting of export trade around that we not just us, all the U.S. grain markets have been talking about in the last week or so, were reflected in those numbers, and that you see the ending stocks figure lowered for the world, again, following from both the lower Argentine production and some of the trade issues that we've been talking about, dropped about 3.6 million metric tons from the March forecast down to about just under 91 million. We were at just under 97 a year ago. So again, another moderately positive impact on first world corn and now world soybean markets. Again, with the whittling down of ending stocks, a little bit of tightening up, concerns now of what's coming out of South America, we're in a little bit better position to see more price responses this summer should any problems come, at least temporarily, in the U.S.
Now, Dan, this is not all to say that the worries about a potential trade war with China have completely dissipated. That's still very much in the background, and the trade is not going to ignore that until something is resolved here.
No, it won't. There was an important statement that came out on Tuesday, the same day as the USDA report, came out from Chinese President Xi Jinping, who, I'll just read the headline in this Reuters article that came out, basically indicating that the Chinese president had promised to open the country's economy further and lower import tariffs on products including cars, and he had given this in a speech that is cited as an attempt to defuse an escalating trade dispute with the U.S. So I don't know what you term this other than an effort to start moving towards the table for some type of a resolution short of the actual imposition of the type of tariffs we've seen that have been talked about for soybeans. I do need to mention that as we're talking about what's happening in China and the issues of tariffs, here we have reports in the trade earlier in the week that there were brisk soybean sales. Again, with soybean sales to Mexico of a fair amount of China, also to unknown destinations, probably end up at China. But the surprise, or the head scratcher, is that two sizable sales of U.S. soybeans to Argentina. And why in the world would soybean sales be going to Argentina? Well, probably with their cutbacks in their own production, they probably are looking to import beans from someplace to keep their crushing plants going.
They're in that dire straits down there.
Yeah, so if they have that going on, then their exports of unprocessed beans have to be affected. So there are some things happening under the surface affecting these corn and soybean markets that have been, I don't think we can call this business as usual because of the impact of these fears about tariffs and whatever else that might come in and affect, particularly the soybean market. But as these factors are entering in, we're seeing movement and, in some cases, downright scrambling to cover supplies because of the uncertainty of what's available from Brazil, China, or even the U.S. as some of these political trade issues come into play.
And wheat, that market is somewhat tranquil at the moment, and the looming factor is that the winter wheat crop, here in Kansas for sure and nationally, isn't improving any. In fact, it's struggling to keep from becoming in worse shape.
I think that's all true, and of course we have the Kansas Wheat Tour coming up in a couple weeks. That will be watched all that much more closely this year. And when we look at the weather maps, and we have dry conditions really all the way from the southern part of Mexico, not New Mexico, Mexico, all the way up to basically the northern border of Kansas. So one way to look at this is to see what's happened on the current old crop, and these are the old crop futures. With all the negative news that basically came out of that USDA report, we have prices that about, for the May contract, about $5.16, $5.17 at one point anyway earlier this week. You look at where that price is at relative to intermediate to long-term moving averages, it's well above them. So we've got, I think, in the face of what is moderate to slow exports, we've got support for the market coming from production concerns. I think it is also fair to say that as we get more and more people out in the field looking at these crops, particularly at that wheat crop tour, that there's the potential, I think, for a fair amount of volatility. If people get out into the fields and see, gosh, it's not quite as bad as we thought, that would probably have a fair negative impact on the wheat futures prices for the Kansas hard red winter wheat contract, and we would probably lose some percent, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10% of some of the gains that we've had of late. So something to watch in coming weeks in the wheat market.
Things to contemplate, producers, as you mull over your marketing opportunities as they might present themselves in these still volatile markets overall. Dan, thanks so much.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
He's our weekly guest. To get into the grain market trends is Dan O'Brien, grain market economist with K-State Research and Extension, and we'll be back to get into more depth on these still churning trade concerns, especially with the country of China, with our next guest here on Agriculture Today.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
You're listening to Agriculture Today. As everybody well knows, what's been at the forefront of agricultural news lately, the concerns over potential, and stressing the word potential, trade tariffs between the People's Republic of China and the United States, with agricultural commodities being caught up in the wake of all of that. We have invited by once more an agricultural economist at Kansas State University, very well versed in international trade matters, Vincent Amanor-Boadu, to lend some perspective on these situations and what they may portend for agriculture. But you're describing this in a special term here, Vincent. You're calling these not necessarily trade disputes, but trade interventions.
Well, it is trade intervention because what we're looking at is a situation where the United States thinks that a particular country's exports into the United States are affecting prices, and we want to balance that using tariffs. And those countries also looking at our exports into their country and saying they want to rebalance that to make sure that the domestic producers are doing well. In addition to tariffs, they can use subsidies and they can use quotas. Generally, we want none of these to be used because we believe that the market is able to take care of all these concerns. So whenever we enter the market and intervene trying to solve the producer's problem, we are actually creating a problem for consumers. And that is what you always see, whether you are using quotas, which basically restrict the quantity that is imported, or you use subsidies, which helps a domestic producer to reduce their cost so they can be competitive in the marketplace, or you use tariffs, which increases the price that imports are sold for in the importing country.
And the end results of each of these tactics will differ from the others, or potentially so,
You
right?
can set them up to give you the same effect, but the incidence, who is paying for it, it's where, the changes occur. So if you are using quotas, for example, there isn't any cost to the government that is, issuing that particular quota, but consumers in the importing country are paying a higher price because the quantity that is being imported is declining, so they're paying a higher price, assuming that demand doesn't change. Now, if you use tariffs, you are immediately increasing prices of imports, because what any importer will do is to add the tariff that they are paying to the government, because tariffs are collected by the government. So they will add a tariff they are paying to the government to the price of the product that has been imported, and consumers will pay that. If you use subsidy to achieve the same result, then the taxpayer is the one who is paying for it, because we are now taking money out of Treasury and giving it to a local producer to reduce their costs so they can be competitive in the international markets.
But you say these can all end up with a similar result, and that result can have lingering, damaging effects on trade?
Oh, yes. And it's important because the tool you choose to use creates that lingering effect. So let's take tariffs, which is what we are talking about nowadays. As soon as you impose a tariff, prices are going to go up. The expectation is that because prices have gone up, imports will decline. Right? Now, the exporters begin to look at that and say, okay, we need alternative markets to sell our product to because we can be competitive in a country that is imposing the tariffs. But they don't always sit down and sit back and do nothing. Like in the case with what we are having with China, the potential risk is that China is going to look, and they've already done that and told us, they look at all their imports from the U.S. and they say, okay, we have a trade surplus in agricultural products with the United States. So we are going to impose counter tariffs on those. So when that happens, we've spent a lot of time, our industries have spent a lot of time in these countries building suppliers.
Over multiple years, obviously.
Numerous years, dozens of years. And then you get these suppliers and say, Kansas wheat is going to supply, and we've got companies that are going to provide you with this wheat to your specifications and all that. And all of a sudden, these tariff and trade skirmishes begin. And so the certainty of supply declines. The importer looks at you and thinks, okay, this is not a very safe or predictable supplier. They begin to look at the second best alternative. In our case, Australia becomes a major competitor in a lot of the products that we are looking at. Brazil becomes a major competitor in the grains area. And even though we have certain advantages, for example, in terms of transportation over Brazil, the cost of uncertainty of supply now becomes important to a buyer. Right? And so if Brazil gets in there with the tariffs in place, it becomes very difficult after we have agreed at the national level to remove those tariffs for us to get back in there. We are basically starting from ground zero, working our way back out. And that can be a very long road to tar once these things are initiated.
So that's your greatest fear, again, if the tariffs would be exacted, that we would damage, maybe not permanently, but for some time, business that has been built up over the last 2 or 3 decades with a country such as China.
That is what I worry about. The tariffs themselves are just like light switches. Governments decide we are going to impose a 25 or 30% tariff, you switch it on. And then tomorrow morning, they decide, okay, we've solved our problem, and they switch it off. The companies, Kansas companies and U.S. companies that lose markets as a result of these fear on the part of their customers as a result of these tariffs, basically are not going to switch over as quickly because they would have invested time to build the new relationships. So the longer these things goes on, the greater the probability that they will build deeper relationships that by the time we come back in the market, we are starting all over again. And that's what I worry about.
And another point that you make, by the way, in a write-up that you're putting together on this very topic, it'll be out soon, Vincent, is when we think of these disagreements with other countries, and in this case China is in the spotlight right now, we're not only dealing with a government, but we're dealing with companies on the other side of the ocean. And that's a perception that gets lost here.
Yes. When we talk about international trade, we always talk about it as countries. But countries don't buy things, right? So just like in the United States, a consumer goes to the market to buy apples from Chile or tomatoes from Mexico, that is the level at which these things are happening. So as soon as we start thinking about it at the country level, we lose sight of the fact that, a Kansas farmer or a Texas farmer who is shipping product to Mexico or to China or to Japan is the one that is going to feel the direct impact of this. It is not at the national level, right? And so I want us to think about trade, even though we always talk about international trade as trade between and among nations. It's not the nations that are making the choices. It's the individual companies, individual consumers that are making all those choices and decisions. And so the impact is felt directly by our companies and by the foreign companies that are involved in this.
Are all of these principles understood in all of this, Ranker? That's a concern, frankly.
And I think that is a conversation that we need to make sure that we understand. Yes, China as a whole has a positive trade balance with the United States. But agriculture as a sector, our farmers as individual producers have a positive trade balance. And that's why they ship stuff, right? We are shipping soybean, we are shipping pork products to China because we can supply these products better than anybody else and make money at doing that, right? If another industry is having trouble in China, then they have a competitive disadvantage. To sacrifice agriculture's interest, and I want to break it down, to sacrifice farmers, individual farmers in Kansas, Wisconsin, California, because individual steel mills are not being competitive in a situation like this. I mean, it's basically like you are picking winners and losers, and then you are sacrificing the current winners for the current losers in the hope that they will be winners later on. And for me, that is the unfair situation whenever these things come up, because U.S. agriculture has not become this good by accident. It has happened through careful investment, careful attention to international competition, and adjustments by our farmers every day to what is going on around the world and how they can maintain their leadership. And if other U.S. industries, because of local advantages, are not thinking in those terms, I think it becomes really, really a dangerous precedent to sacrifice, Middle America and what farmers are doing and have been doing for generations because we want to save some other industry. I mean, that's what I want our farmers to pay attention to.
Well put. It will be watched very keenly in the weeks ahead as to what will develop from these trade disputes or interventions. And we appreciate the comments right here, Vincent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric.
He is Vincent Amanor-Boadu. He is an agricultural economist here at Kansas State University. Be watching for his article on adverse trade interventions and rural America's prosperity. That'll be posted quite soon on agmanager.info. And you're tuned to Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
For you now on Agriculture Today, Kansas agricultural weather, as we recap this seesaw we've been on the last several days, winter to summer, back. Mary Knapp is along with us once more, research and extension climatologist at K-State, and we're fully accustomed, Mary, to abrupt changes in the weather, and this past week was very typical of that.
Right, and if we look at the week ending Tuesday of this week, which is what goes in to feed the U.S. Drought Monitor, the week was colder than normal, which probably won't surprise anybody, but it is interesting to note just how much colder than normal it was. Statewide, we were almost 12 degrees cooler than would be typical at this time of the year. The warm spot, which was southwest Kansas, averaged 43.7 degrees, and they were 7 degrees cooler than normal. So again, some very widespread, very cold temperatures, which, given all of the talk that we've had about the extreme freeze, is not going to be much of a surprise to producers. It should be noted that those very cold temperatures made their way all the way down to southeast Kansas. Usually southeast Kansas manages to stay a little bit warmer than the rest of the state, and they did this time, but they still had a low of 18 degrees, which is very cold for this time of the year. Up in the northwest part of the state, they got down to 4 degrees. So, again, very cold temperatures any way you slice it.
Now, that was up to Tuesday. Last couple of days, we've seen extremely warm weather, summer-like.
Right. We have had some summer-like temperatures. I had some people call in from the central part of the state, the Salina area, and they were going, okay, is this a record? It wasn't a record for the date. They've had temperatures in the 90s on these days, so they'll be approaching it, but not record level yet. It might surprise them to know that the hottest temperature recorded in Salina in April, 105 degrees. So there's a lot of upside yet on that range of temperatures that we can see. The interesting part is that we're going to go off the cliff on the roller coaster again, and we're looking at highs tomorrow, maybe making it up to 40. And lows, again, in the mid to lower 20s. There'll probably be some teens in parts of the state. And those will likely, in many cases, set record cold high temperatures and record cold low temperatures for the date. So when I do my April summary, I'm likely to have a lot of records on both sides of the scale. Here in Manhattan, we've already set 3 record cold temperatures. So we'll just have to see how the rest of the month plays out.
Well, the constant, regrettably, the dryness. And once more, that was dominant in this past week.
Right. Statewide, we averaged 0.09 of an inch of precip, and that's only 19% of normal for the week. What was different this week was that the big winners of the rainfall lottery, if you will, were the southern divisions, and that included southwestern Kansas. They averaged 0.12 of an inch, which is only 35% of normal, but is much more than they've had for several weeks. So again, that was one of the highest. The South Central fared just slightly better. The total was more. They had 0.2 of an inch, and that was 36% of normal. Southeast also averaged 0.12 of an inch, but that's only 17% of what they would typically see. So again, even the winners of the lottery didn't win much. They're more a case of slowing down the degradation rather than making any kind of material improvements. It's also worth noting that out in western Kansas, where they did have those significant amounts of rain, the amounts of evapotranspiration that occurred were 3-4 times what they received in actual precipitation. So not much impact on the overall drought conditions. We need to have sustained rains for a long period of time to see much improvement.
That in mind, what about this system moving in today? And there will be a sharp change in the temperatures, as you note. Will that be accompanied by anything resembling decent moisture?
There might be some fairly decent moisture, but it's going to be pretty much confined to the northern tier of counties, and the strongest signal for moisture will be in the northwest. So we're talking Cheyenne, Rawlins, Decatur County area, where they may see as much as a half an inch out of this system. They're talking snowfall totals of somewhere around 7 inches, which when you accompany that with 40, 50 mile an hour winds, they do have blizzard warnings out for most of north central and northwestern Kansas, and that persists all the way as far east as Hays. Now, Hays, the snowfall totals that they're predicting are not as high. They're talking 1 inch to 2 inches, but keep in mind if that inch of snow is blowing around in the air, your visibility is going to be extremely limited, and with the strong winds, it's going to meet that blizzard criteria. Unfortunately, that's not going to translate to a lot of moisture.
According to the quantity precipitation index, you say?
Yeah, if you look at the quantitative precip forecast for the 3 days ending on Monday, we're looking at maybe 1/10 to 1/4 of an inch in the areas that are favored with the heavier snow. They may see as much as 3/4 of an inch, but most of it's going to be a half an inch or less. And the further south you go, the less that's likely to translate into actual moisture. And if you're in that south central area, they're not even talking getting 1/100th of an inch out of it. If you don't get it this weekend, chances at this point don't look very promising for the rest of the week.
If there's any hope, you say it's in the extended 8 to 14 day forecast, which may feature better chances for rain.
Right. And actually, if we look at the 8 to 14, one of the encouraging things with that is they are calling for an increased chance of wetter than normal conditions, but that increased chance is up to over 50%. Which is a very strong signal for above normal moisture. We've seen some of the others where it said an increased chance of wetter than normal, but it's 38% instead of 33%. It just wasn't very strong. This is a much stronger signal, so we can hope that it actually materializes and we start seeing a wetter end to April.
It's a long time coming. And Mary, as always, thanks for being over. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Eric.
She's Mary Knapp, Research and Extension climatologist at K-State, and that's the latest from the Weather Data Library here at the University on Kansas agricultural weather. Our time's away for today. Thanks for being along with us. Enjoy your weekend. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.